Hello folks, and I'll be totally honest with you. When I woke up this morning, I did not think I'll be creating a video on this topic. But the government of UK has really impressed me on three levels. Number one, they moved away from an old framework called jQuery. And people say that governments usually take a lot of time to move away and to innovate and to develop, but they did it faster than many private companies. There are a lot of private tech companies who are still using jQuery, and they did not the impossible, but a fairly big task that doesn't really change anything for the end users. It's mostly for developers. Second, they didn't really have to create any documentation, and to be honest, they didn't even have to tell anyone about it. But the fact that they made the public announcement that we moved away from jQuery and now we are using vanilla JavaScript is amazing. But they also explained the difficulty, the challenge that they faced, which we'll discuss in this video so that we can learn from them, right? If you have to move away from jQuery to JavaScript, maybe you're hired in a company that is planning to move away from jQuery, well, I think these insights might be very useful and valuable for you. And also, they did not only say the challenges or explain the challenges that they faced, they even explained the reasons why they moved away from jQuery in the first place. Because if everyone is moving away from jQuery, that means there's a smoke, right? That means something is happening, but doesn't mean you should move away from jQuery, right? There has to be certain reasons that tell companies that, hey, jQuery is probably old and we need to move away from it, right? So they explain all of that as well. Why Angular has stopped supporting jQuery, right? Why companies are running away from it. And probably if you're working for a company that has no plans to move away from jQuery, well, you better run away from there because you don't really want to be stuck working on a framework that is no longer used anywhere else outside your own company or firm you're working for. Or maybe you have your own company. Start thinking about changing. But in this video, I think we learn a lot. First of all, why we move away from jQuery. And second of all, what are the challenges that are faced and how jQuery is actually different than vanilla JavaScript and how we can replace those snippets, how we can replace the jQuery snippets with JavaScript snippets in 2022, right? Today, jQuery has a lot of disadvantages, but one of the biggest one is that it's doing something that vanilla JavaScript now can easily do, because now browsers have evolved a lot. jQuery used to be very helpful and a great utility library a few years ago, right? But not anymore. Now we can do most of the things with vanilla JavaScript. And when you can do something with vanilla JavaScript, it's already a good reason to do it with, right? Because jQuery, let's say, takes about 50 to 80 KBs to download, right? And it has to be in your core assets of your website. So whenever you load a website, let's say your home page is about 200 KBs, right? And then you load jQuery about 50 KBs over your home page, right? So that means 1/5 of your website, so 20% of the speed of your website is being impacted. Your website is 20% slower just because you use jQuery. Now, if it saves months and months and hours of developer time to use a library like that, sometimes it's worth it, right? Because if your developers without using jQuery are pissed off and take 10 times longer to do the same project, well, it's better to use a library like jQuery in that case. But now, developers already prefer vanilla JavaScript more. It's more reliable, more stable. It is light because all browsers already have JavaScript inbuilt, right? So it's probably a good choice to make your website 20% faster and also make your developers happier, right? It's a win-win for all situations, for your clients and for your dev team. And I think that's a great step to move forward with. Now, they even explain how they did it. The number one thing is that they were using an older version of jQuery. And whenever you are using an older version of a library that you want to get rid of, you have two options. Option number one, which sucks, which is upgrade the jQuery to the latest version. Well, what will that do? That will, yes, maybe improve a few things, but eventually you want to move away from it, right? If you have an old shitty building and a newer very modern building, you don't really want to make a bridge between them, right? You want to completely move away from the old one into the new one, right? So what they decided was that rather than upgrading jQuery and spending a few weeks of development time on that, because there might be some breaking changes, right? They decided that, hey, we'll move away from jQuery completely. Rather than upgrading it, maybe rather than spending 4 weeks, we will spend 3 months, right? 12 weeks, 3 times the time. But we will do it the right way. So first thing they did was, whenever a new feature was required, they stopped building it with jQuery. They stopped using that, so that at least the new requirement, the new feature doesn't have to be migrated to vanilla JavaScript in the future, right? So that's a smart move. Then they started allocating time for developers to, hey, you're working on, let's say, the contact us page, and you wanted to change the headline. Well, instead of just changing the headline, maybe you can also change the AJAX call that was made with jQuery and do it with vanilla JavaScript, right? So whenever someone was working on small pieces of code and there was some code parallel to it that could be improved by moving away from jQuery and maybe spending a few more hours on that project that any developer was working on, was a really smart move, because now you're not really saying, hey, stop everything and do this. You're saying, hey, you had to change the headline and a few other things on a page, which was supposed to take you maybe a couple of hours. Instead of spending 2 hours, we wanted to spend 10 hours and do some optimization and move away from jQuery, which is a really amazing way. I'm actually very impressed with the UK government. But now we have talked a lot about the theoretical part. Let's actually see in code how jQuery is different from JavaScript and how you can remove your jQuery code and start using JavaScript from today, day one. Yes, let's get into it. I'm reading this documentation and it's just amazing. They even have explained how their own modules were. You can go into the links and learn more about it, but we're not really interested in, a country's website and how they used to develop. We're interested in general things that all of us can learn, right? So let's have a look at that. So they referred a website called youmightnotneedjQuery.com. It's a very famous website, and I'll be honest, I used it a couple of years ago when I was working on a project. We wanted to move away from jQuery, so I can relate with that. This website, basically, you put in a jQuery code and it gives you as an output a vanilla JavaScript code of it. So you don't even have to think much, right? Obviously, there will be some tricks based on your code and your code base, but it's actually amazing that websites like this exist and you can just plug and play. Well, the first problem that they say they faced was that in jQuery, you could simply select a div and then add a class by using the function add class, right? So you could do something like this. But now with JavaScript, you can't really do that. First of all, you have to use a query selector. Now, to understand what a query selector really does, you have to pass in an element name, for example, a div, and it will select the first div available on your website. And if it can't find anything, for example, let's say you pass a P for paragraph, and if it cannot find any paragraph in your whole website, in your whole page, it will return a null, right? So in this case, they're using a div, as we can see. Now, after selecting the element, we can't just write .add class. It won't work and it would throw an error. So instead, what we want to do is we want to say element.classList.add. So class list, you can consider it like an array, and you can add and remove things from it. It's not really an array, but just to understand that you can add classes by doing classList.add, and you can also remove by doing classList.remove. So it's pretty straightforward. Whereas in jQuery, it looks easier, right? There's less line of code, but again, 20% optimization. You have to make the choice. And this is pretty amazing. I personally forgot about this concept that yes, jQuery is much more forgiving than JS. For example, if you try to find a document or a paragraph or a div or anything on your page, right, and you can't find it, jQuery won't return you null. It will just return you an empty object. Now, what that means is that in JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, when you use a query selector and you try to find an element with class, this, as in this example here, right? If the element is not found, it will return null, as we just discussed about it, right? But the problem here is that if you try to do null dot, let's say add class or class list or any other operation, you will get, in Java terms, a null pointer exception, or you'll get an error that says this null object doesn't have a property class list, right? So you can have errors, so therefore you need to do some checking. For example, here they have the if condition. They're first checking if the element exists, and only then they can do something. Now, we already covered what query selector is, but there's something called as query selector all, which basically means you're trying to select all the elements, because query selector just selects the first one that matches with your query. Here it will select all the elements with the class that, in this case, or maybe a div if you pass a div, and then it will return you an array-like object, and you can then do operations on it, right? So in that case, array will always be returned, but it can be an empty array. For example, an array with no elements. So in this case, you can't just check if example2. You have to check if example2.length, right? Reason being because empty array you can't really do much on it, right? So you need to check if the array actually has something in it. So it's just a few things you need to take care of. And then they even explain when to use query selector and query selector all, which is amazing. So they're under no obligation to share any of the technical details of their website, but they do share it with us, and I'm, impressed with the fact, right? I know a lot of libraries, a lot of professional companies don't do documentations as nice as the UK government did it. I'm really impressed. What can I say? Then let's see another example, another challenge that they say they faced, which was getting and setting attributes. So as you can see in jQuery, we can just do element.attr, which is short for attribute, and we can just read the class attribute in this case. And if you want to set something, you use the same function, and it's kind of an overloaded function. You just pass the second argument, which will be used to set the property. So it's pretty straightforward, right? The same function. If you don't pass the second argument, you are getting it. If you pass the second argument, you are setting something. But I think it can be a little confusing, and I really like the JavaScript way more, because in JavaScript you will say get attribute and set attribute instead of calling the same overloaded function again and again. So I personally like the vanilla JavaScript more in this case. Then the next one is chaining functions. As you can see in this example that they shared, that chaining is very easy in jQuery, right? You can select an element and do add class, add data, hide, show, etc. You can do a lot of things in the same line. But in JavaScript, you will have to write 3 lines of code for that, because first of all you'll say, hey, I want to add a class, then I want to set an attribute, and I want to set a style, display style, to be hidden. Instead of 1 line, you have to write 3 lines. But it gets a little worse, because in jQuery, when you write this statement, as you can see on the screen, you can select all the divs and apply it to all the divs on your website, right? So 1 line of code, and if you have 20 divs on your page, all 20 divs will be affected, as simple as that, single line of code. But in JavaScript, the problem is that you have to write a for loop. First of all, you have to select all the elements by doing a query selector all, and once you do have them, you have to loop over them one by one, set property on each and every div, which is much more elaborate, right? Which is nice. The code is clear and concise. Well, not concise, because instead of 1 line, you have to write now 7 lines of code, but I still don't hate it because the code is clear. It's just more code, and developers in general, including me, we don't really like to write a lot of code. We like to write as little as possible. And well, we like to write as little as possible for 2 reasons. One, we are lazy, and second one, the less code you have, the less things you have to maintain, and it's easier to debug, etc, etc. Yeah. I think you get the point. Now, there are a few more things that they have described on their page, so I'll link to that in the description below. And I really think it's amazing. I'm impressed, and I hope you are too. I hope you learned something new in this video, and at least this video might have acted as news to you, because yes, there are governments who are doing migrations into newer technologies, and I hope your company or wherever you work, or maybe you can encourage someone to do the same, because yes, we want to move forward as a community and we want to work on newer projects, and it's good for you, good for me, good for everyone. And again, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new. Let us know in the comments down below if you learned anything new today, right? Maybe you knew about JavaScript and jQuery, but did not know about, the UK government making this change. So let us know in the description or comments below, I really appreciate it, and see you until next time. Bye-bye.